All right. Hello, everybody. Nice to see you nice to see you all on the second day of our conference. I am Christine, and I am the head of strategic initiatives at the Aquatic Life Institute. I'd like to welcome you all to this panel with Sarah and Kathy on the ongoing legislative groundwork for farmed fish in the US. I have a couple of housekeeping reminders. All audience members have their cameras and audios off upon entry. Please use the Q&A box to pose your questions and we will take them at the end. We are recording every session and streaming live on Facebook, and we expect respectful and productive discussions and have no tolerance for harassment or discrimination of any kind. The session is 50 minutes long. Each panelist will speak for about 15 minutes, followed by Q&A. Now, I'd like to introduce you to our panelists. Sarah Hanneken is an attorney specializing in litigation and legislation impacting farmed animals. As legal advocacy counsel at Animal Equality, Sarah pursues strategic impact litigation and legislative initiatives to protect the interests of animals in agriculture. And we also have Kathy Hessler, who is a clinical professor of law at Lewis and Clark Law School. She is the first faculty member hired to teach animal law full-time in law school. So I will hand it over to our panelists to start this very interesting session. Go ahead.
Thanks so much, Christine, and hi, everybody. I will share my screen. And then, all right, hopefully that looks correct to everyone. Okay, awesome. So yeah, as Christine said, we're going to talk about legal work for farmed fish that's happening in the US and some strategic decisions and different choices that have been made and some exciting stuff that's going on here. So I will turn it over to Kathy for an important acknowledgement.
Thanks, Sarah. We are both coming to you from Portland, Oregon in the US, and here we like to honor the indigenous people on whose traditional and ancestral homelands we stand, including the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Guatlala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin Kalapuya, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. We know that land acknowledgements are fraught, but we think we can learn much about respectful relationships with animals and the planet from these historical and present-day communities. We also want to offer our thanks to the organizers, the other presenters, the sponsors, and all of you attendees. So thank you and welcome to the session.
All right, so I figured we would start with a quick roadmap of our presentation today. So we'll start by running through most of the high-profile US legal matters that are involving farmed fish, from lawsuits to regulatory petitions, legislative actions, and a couple things in between. Following that, the bulk of our presentation will be focused on two legal projects that my organization and Kathy's have been collaborating on. One stemming from an undercover investigation that my organization conducted at a catfish slaughterhouse in the US state of Mississippi. And the other is a legislative effort that we spearheaded here in our home state of Oregon. And then with any remaining time we have, we'll chat a little bit about collaboration and the strategic decisions that I mentioned for farm fish welfare work and answer any questions you have. So let's get into it. As I mentioned, we'll start with about a 10-minute overview of a handful of legal matters that you can see listed here, and then we'll get into the exciting details about the two projects that Animal Equality and the Aquatic Animal Law Initiative are collaborating on. So we're going to start with a lawsuit that Animal Equality filed last year against a pet food company called Champion Pet Foods. And Champion makes a line of pet food products under the brand name Akana. And the basis of this lawsuit was that Champion was advertising the rainbow trout ingredients in its Akana products as wild caught, when strong evidence actually linked the trout to industrial fish farms. So it makes sense why a company might choose to highlight its seafood ingredients as wild caught, considering the extreme crowding, painful parasites, and other stressors that exist on commercial fish farms. Many consumers realize that fish are better off in the wild. Yet, like I said, we had strong evidence that linked the rainbow trout ingredients to industrial fish farms. And that evidence included laboratory testing of the products, which turned up chemical residues indicative of fish farming. And also just the simple fact that we knew that there's no commercial scale wild capture fisheries for the rainbow trout species in these products. And so any rainbow trout that exists in products that are sold at a large scale would have to come from industrial aquaculture as a practical matter. So the case ended up settling pretty quickly. And as part of the resolution, and in light of Champion's stated commitment to transparency, the company agreed that its future packaging and digital marketing content will provide greater clarity regarding the farm-raised sourcing of the trout ingredients in its products. And Champion has also agreed to partner with an animal welfare consultant to provide additional animal welfare education to employees, and arranged for pertinent employees to become certified in animal welfare auditing. The next thing I want to briefly talk about is an undercover investigation released in 2019 by the nonprofit Animal Outlook. And this was an expose of a salmon aquaculture operation in the US state of Maine. The investigator worked inside a hatchery that supplied, among other brands, Martha Stewart's True North seafood line. And the investigation revealed filthy conditions, rampant disease, widespread cruelty to these intensively farmed fish. Some more specific findings: workers were abusing fish, including slamming and stomping on them, violently throwing them, including treating them like basketballs and performing trick shots. Workers were cruelly killing fish by slamming them on the ground. The investigator found underfed, hungry fish that were so starved that they mistook the pupils of other fish's eyes for food and were eating them. Painful spinal deformities. I don't know if you can tell from the photo here, but there's a fish that is experiencing very severe spinal deformity, as well as fungal growth, even fungus eating away at their faces. So very unpleasant things that were documented there as a general, just matter of course. And nevertheless, the fish from this facility became products marketed as high welfare under the True North brand. So after the investigation, Animal Outlook went to state officials and asked them to investigate the Cook facility and enforce Maine's animal cruelty law. And although the state acknowledged that fish suffer and feel pain and are protected under the law, they said, sorry, there's no agency here that's responsible for enforcing this animal cruelty law for fish and aquaculture facilities. And they also said that there were no welfare standards that existed for fish that prosecutors could use to judge Cook's practices against, though you'd think, officials could determine that throwing fish around like a basketball probably doesn't fit within any reasonable welfare standards. Nevertheless, that was the response Animal Outlook got. So they started a petition for rulemaking, which Animal Equality and a handful of other groups have signed on to, demanding that Maine pass aquaculture best management practices through a robust rulemaking process that NGOs and animal welfare scientists could participate in, rather than arbitrarily deferring to low standards set by the industry itself. And this is a common problem we see, where egregious systemic cruelty is revealed at an industrial animal farm, regardless of species, and law enforcement, they don't know what to do, and they simply go to the industry itself and ask if the conduct looks okay to them, which of course they say it looks fine. So then nothing is done to stop the practices. So Animal Outlook's petition process is currently ongoing. And then the other aspect of this that I want to just mention briefly is another false advertising lawsuit that Animal Outlook filed against Cook Aquaculture, basically arguing that the company's advertisements of True North seafood brand, which tout its practices as being sustainable and ecologically sound, claiming the salmon are naturally raised under optimal animal welfare practices, and some of these terms are in quotes, that these claims constitute false advertising in light of what the investigator found, and that case is currently ongoing. The last quick hit I'll talk about is the Keep Finfish Free Act, which is legislation that was introduced in Congress that aims to put the brakes on unchecked expansion of industrial aquaculture operations in federal waters. And this bill was introduced in response to efforts under the previous US president to grant permits to companies to begin operating in the Gulf of Mexico and elsewhere without having the proper authority to do so and without complying with critical environmental laws. There was a hearing on this bill back in July in Congress, but unfortunately, there's been no action on the bill since. And with that, I'll hand it over to Kathy to talk about some litigation and additional legislation that's related to this matter.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, as Sarah said, we're just doing some quick hits on these things, but we wanted to give you an overview of sort of the legal regulatory current situation in the US. And so this case, the Gulf fishermen's case, we sometimes just refer to it as the NOAA case, is the most important case in the US right now, addressing the construct, the context of aquaculture. And that's because we have a federal regime under the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Act that manages fisheries across all the jurisdictional waters of the US. Within that structure, the NOAA, which is one of the agencies in the US, tried to give a permit to a huge aquaculture facility in open waters, and were sued as a result of that. And the court said, yeah, you can't do that. You don't actually have jurisdiction to give permits to aquaculture facilities because the law only allows you to give permits for fishing facilities. And so that was a really important case, saying that in the US, the federal level, we have no permitting authority, we have no jurisdiction, we have no federal framework, regulatory framework, statutory framework for managing aquaculture. And so this leaves open a relatively large hole to determine how to move forward both at the state and the federal level. So this is a Fifth Circuit case in the US, which means it only affects part of the country in a formal sense, although it seems to have a larger impact because facilities aren't really clear whether they should be moving forward until this regulatory conversation is addressed. So moving on to a couple of other cases, we've got, we'll move it, thank you. So we have a couple of other cases that are mostly focusing on environmental impact. So what we have, there are a couple of other kinds of cases, as Sarah mentioned, and there are a few others that we're not mentioning, but we're trying again to give you a sense of the types of litigation that are arising in the US regarding aquaculture. And so these two cases are focusing on environmental harms that result from aquaculture in the water stream. So we have this first case, the Wild Fish Conservancy case, which was a suit against Cook Aquaculture, who were trying to raise domesticated steelhead in Puget Sound in net pens, and were granted authority to do that, but they had not conducted an environmental impact statement. They had not conducted a comprehensive scientific review of the environmental impacts to threatened and endangered species, or done a review of the ecosystem of Puget Sound in general. And so the argument is, without having done that, the aquaculture should not proceed. So in the status of this case is a little odd because the lawsuit was filed, the Cook Aquaculture was moving forward, a sort of request for an injunctive process was started, where the folks in the lawsuit said, you really can't begin while this lawsuit is pending. We have to actually answer these questions. And the court has actually allowed them to begin their process without resolving the important issues that are raised in this case, which is problematic. In another suit, the Center for Biological Diversity sued a number of entities for renewing what we have here in the US called a nationwide fishing permit, which basically is a simple structure to allow a lot of people to get fishing permits without going through individualized processes to determine what the impact is. And so they said, we really can't be doing that if these permits are going to jeopardize endangered species and critical habitats. And so trying to bring those things together. So those are a couple of the environmental approaches that people are taking with respect to aquaculture. And then moving forward, in response to some of this conversation, our Congress has tried a couple of times to develop a federal framework for regulating aquaculture. And so it's called the Aqua Act. It's been reintroduced just a few weeks ago here in the US. It would establish national standards for what they call sustainable offshore aquaculture. And it would create a sort of department. It would focus on unified permitting and a review process. It actually has some good things in there, some conversation about feed, but welfare is not really a part of the conversation. And it's designed to encourage aquaculture rather than to sort of curtail it and regulate it, and it designates aquaculture as a complement to fishing systems rather than a competitor to it, which probably needs to be explored a good deal more. So that's the framework. It's just begun. It's very difficult to predict what's going to happen in the Congress of the US these days. So we'll just let you know that that's happening. And then we've got a couple of other types of legislation at the federal level. We're not focusing on state legislation here until we talk to what we're doing in Oregon. And so just to give you a sense of the kinds of things that are happening in relation to aquaculture. So the Shellfish Aquaculture Improvement Act sounds like it might be a good thing, but it really is just limiting recovery for injuries for workers in that sector. Illegal Fishing and Forced Labor Prevention Act is good. It is trying to address the problems of illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. The Ocean-Based Climate Solutions Act doesn't even have a summary yet up on the government website, but there are some good provisions, at least if we're looking at what they introduced last time that didn't go through. Focusing on sustaining America's fisheries and amending that Fisheries Act, the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Act that I talked about before. Keeping America's waterfronts working is, again, to expand access to coastal waters for fishing, aquaculture, things like boating, a few other things as well, but trying to make the business access to coastal waters more preserved and protected, which is potentially problematic in a number of ways. And another good one, prevention of escapement of genetically altered salmon. It actually does prevent the sale, the purchase, the release, even the trade of genetically altered salmon in the US. So basically people aren't supposed to be doing that in the US waters if this passes. And lastly, I just wanted to mention the Cormorant Relief Act, which sounds like it's protecting cormorants, but it isn't. It's allowing the killing of cormorants who are eating fish at aquaculture facilities, the open pad. So we can't, of course, have the birds eating their natural prey because that's getting in the way of our aquaculture production. So that's a very, very problematic one. So that's just a quick hit on other kinds of legislation. And then the last thing I'll say before we get into a deep dive is the Aquaculture Certification. So we don't have certification processes sort of specific to our federal level in the US, but we think about it in 3 different levels. So there are nonprofit certifications, there's industrial ones that come from processors, facilities, and the industry lobbyists, and then government certifications. And so we're keeping an eye on those kinds of things. In the US, we have a few states like Florida who have certificates of registration and they have some constraints. Obviously, there are national ones beyond the US and some others that we can look at and talk about later. So that's a quick hit on that.
Awesome. Thanks, Kathy. So there's your crash course in U.S. legal advocacy related to farm fish. And with that, I'll turn to one of the exciting projects that Animal Equality and the Aquatic Animal Law Initiative are currently working on together. And then Kathy will talk about the other. And the first one relates to, as I mentioned, an undercover investigation Animal Equality did. And then, as Kathy mentioned, the other is an exciting legislative initiative that we have spearheaded here in Oregon. So The first deep dive is into this undercover investigation that Animal Equality released. It spearheaded a variety of different legal advocacy tactics, the first being a criminal complaint, then some civil complaints, a legislative initiative, and then most recently a supplementary action that aims indirectly to put pressure on the company to improve its practices. So I'll talk about each of these aspects of the legal side of this investigation. So the investigator went and got a job at a slaughterhouse in the state of Mississippi. And what they documented while they were there was a variety of really troubling animal welfare matters. Probably one of the most disturbing is that fish were routinely left on this conveyor belt that you can see during employee breaks for many minutes, sometimes up to an hour. They were just left, unable to breathe, slowly suffocating. Also, most of the catfish were beheaded while still conscious. And this happened either because they woke up after being initially stunned due to the amount of time that they spent on the conveyors, as I just mentioned, or because the electric current was simply not strong enough, or the voltage. So the end result was that they were being beheaded while still conscious. And I don't have any video or photo of this, but there was actually, the investigator documented a severed catfish head, like with their mouth still moving. So they can remain conscious for a little while. It's really important that they be properly stunned. And that was not happening here. Also, turtles and rejected bycatch fish were taken off the line and placed into buckets to be later ground up alive, and according to one employee, used as feed for the company's still growing catfish. In a particularly heartbreaking scene, there was a turtle that was thrown onto a moving conveyor carrying severed catfish heads, and the turtle was like desperately trying to crawl in the opposite direction as they were carried towards the grinder. So really obvious that these animals do not want to die. The investigator also documented undersized, deformed, and parasite scarred fish left alive in bins without water on the slaughter floor for hours. So Animal Equality sent a letter detailing all of these findings to local law enforcement, urging them to further investigate and take appropriate enforcement action against Simmons in order to abate the ongoing violations of animal welfare. In January of this year, the county sheriff's office responded, stating, basically agreeing that what we laid out in our letter was concerning. And so we sent the sheriff's office a big packet of additional evidence supporting the claims. Professor Hessler also produced a detailed memo outlining how the evidence that Animal Equality gathered amounted to criminal conduct under Mississippi's animal cruelty law. So the county prosecutor, nevertheless, declined to acknowledge the violations and take any action to consider the matter at all. And in fact, his response was so flippant and frankly irritated that we even were bothering him about this, that I want to read it to you verbatim. He said, "I have no interest in any of this. In addition, my wife and I both hunt and fish and eat what we kill, as do a majority of the people in this state. I have much more to do as a prosecutor than to waste my time with this. I suggest that you stay in Oregon and see if you can find someone who makes their living by fishing to pursue there. I want you to leave me alone, and I'm blocking you at this point." This is a government official after I emailed him 2 times, very politely. So we turned to other tactics, including false advertising complaints, which you can kind of sense a theme here. Companies very frequently make claims that are either just blatantly false or unlawfully deceptive. And in this case, Simmons made a blatantly false claim that we highlighted in complaints to the the consumer protection, if only there were animal protection departments of the state attorneys general offices in 5 states where salmon catfish products are sold. And given the investigative evidence that we had that the company was routinely leaving fish on conveyors for 45 minutes to an hour, their claim that fish were processed within 30 minutes of the time that they arrived at the slaughterhouse was obviously false. And so Simmons ended up removing the claim about processing time from its website. Of course, we would prefer that companies actually improve their practices to meet their claims rather than just remove the claims. But that was the tack they chose to take. So also stemming from this investigation came a legislative initiative. So Animal Equality is petitioning members of the US Congress to amend a federal law that's called the Humane Methods of Livestock Slaughter Act. And this law presently excludes fish from its protections. And the HMSA went into effect in 1958 with the explicit goal of preventing needless suffering. And at the time of the Act's passage, animals that were most commonly slaughtered on a commercial scale were mammals, and the law has since been interpreted to apply only to those species. Fish and other aquatic animals, in addition to chickens and turkeys and other poultry, are not protected. Now, to be fair, back in 1958, there was not a lot of scientific data showing that fish suffer and feel pain, although I think some of us always just knew that intuitively. Now, however, 6 decades later, the science is very well established, and what's more, farmed aquatic animals now vastly outnumber their terrestrial counterparts in the slaughter process. So two more reasons to extend protections to them. So the petition explains that this extension of protections can be accomplished easily with a simple amendment to the Act that just deletes the express exemption of fish. And it's worth noting that catfish slaughterhouses in particular are already federally inspected for food safety purposes, but the inspectors do not have any jurisdiction to look for animal welfare violations. So, all the government would have to do is amend the law to extend that authority and those protections. And we also point out in our petition that other nations with thriving aquaculture industries already require stunning before slaughter. So that proves that it's logistically and economically possible for the United States to do so as well. And then finally, since local law enforcement were unwilling to take any action in light of the clear animal welfare violations that I described, that Animal Equality's investigator documented and we have firsthand evidence of, we decided to also put indirect pressure on the company to improve its practices by alerting the various companies that it sells its catfish to. This information about who it sells through was readily available on Simmons' website, as you can see here. And among the retailers selling Simmons products is the Kroger Company, which is a major supermarket corporation with locations all around the United States. And so we first alerted Kroger to the violations at its catfish supplier. When the investigation broke, the company responded promising to conduct a full and fair investigation. However, a couple of weeks later, they emailed us to let us know that they spoke with Simmons and its trade group, the Catfish Farmers of America, and surprise, surprise, found no welfare violations. So it's yet another example of the problem I mentioned a bit earlier, with public and private institutions going to the industry itself, asking if the practices that we are concerned with are problematic or not. So we respectfully responded to Kroger's response with a stern letter explaining that going to the wrongdoer and asking them if they did any wrong does not constitute a full and fair investigation. And when Kroger did not give us a timely response to that follow-up, we launched an action alert, encouraging our supporters to contact key Kroger officials, demanding that they take the matter seriously and drop Simmons in light of the clear animal welfare violations that we documented. And the petition just reiterated the findings and explained how the conduct and conditions at Simmons violated the animal cruelty laws of Mississippi, which nobody has really disputed, I will point out. it has not been applied to fish before, but the law is very clear. And in the letter that our supporters sent, it explained that not only are these findings upsetting, but it also means that given the violation of the animal cruelty law, the company is violating the first rule of Kroger's vendor code of practice, which is that a vendor may not engage in any action or practice in violation of the laws or regulations of any country or other location in which it does business. And so state laws obviously fall under that broad umbrella of regulations that vendors must comply with. And so we pointed out, if the company allows this behavior in its supply chain, it's allowing countless animals to suffer and harming the company's integrity for not upholding its own policies. So in just a few days, over 1,000 people had emailed Kroger in response to our action alert with this message and asked the company to reconsider its decision to not drop Simmons as a supplier. And a week later, we met with Kroger and they agreed to reopen their investigation in light of the additional information we provided to them. That's how they put it, including putting them in touch with some fish welfare experts. So our fins are crossed that they come to a more sensible determination this time around. And with that, I will turn it over to Kathy to talk about the other project that we are working on together.
Thanks, Sarah. And we should mention that we're working on this with other people as well, but Sarah reached out to us at the Animal Law Clinic and the Aquatic Animal Law Initiative a couple of years ago, because we were both like-minded in wanting to address some of the problems that we see with the regulation of aquaculture. And so we started with an understanding that derives in part from our experience and follows the Simmons catfish example, that the situation in the US is problematic in that fish are not always protected, even within the structures, the legal structures that we have to protect other animals. So they're not included in the Humane Slaughter Act. They're not included in the 28 transport hour law. They're not included in every state anti-cruelty laws. And there aren't specific regulations with respect to how they should be treated during their breeding, their captivity, the on-farm, the capture, the transport, or slaughter, right? So what we have is not a great regulatory scheme in the US at the state or federal level for farmed animals. And what few protections we have, the fish are usually excluded from, or the aquatic animals are excluded from. So we were trying to figure out how to address that problem. And also to bring that problem to the attention of legislators who don't actually even realize that. So we were having to explain to people that the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act exclude these animals. And so this is problematic, that there is some regulation for terrestrial agriculture, there is some regulation for wild caught fishing, but again, the aquatic animals in aquaculture are excluded generally from those small bits of protection that the other animals are afforded. So we were trying to figure out what made sense, and we also realized that the scientific understanding of these animals is lagging, and the understanding of what's happening in these industrial settings is lagging. And so we needed to help people understand, for instance, that these animals can feel pain, because if they don't understand, if people don't understand these animals feel pain, they certainly wouldn't understand why we're arguing they need to be protected from feeling pain in these situations. And so we need to have folks understand, not just because we're saying it, but there is scientific evidence, as Sarah said, to back it up, and increasing amounts of evidence. And not just that these animals can feel pain, but they have other kinds of capacities too that we're interfering with, which is causing them harm, psychological harm, biological stress, all kinds of things. So we needed to raise together, sort of compile some of that scientific information so that we could share it with regulators and decision makers. And we also needed people to understand what these industrial practices are, what they look like, what they do, and how problematic they are for animals, both on the commercial level and the legal level. Having said that, we moved on to thinking about what we would do in Oregon. So on the next slide, we've got our focus on humane slaughters, where we decided to start. We thought that this would be a helpful place to begin, because it's relatively simple to discuss. It's hard to oppose, at least sort of from a moral level, that we're saying if we're going to raise and use these animals for food, we should actually make sure that they have a humane slaughter, right, before they become food for us. And we have theoretically those kinds of protections for some other animals. We don't cover all animals, which is problematic in and of itself, but it's kind of a hard thing we have a regulatory system, and we're basically saying, let's include these animals into that system. We've already identified humane slaughter as something, a goal that we have adopted in the United States, theoretically. So we thought that would be a small place to start, easy to explain to people why we wanted to do it, and hard for them to refute. It turns out it was harder than we thought, in part because of what I had just said. All of that education has been taking longer than we realized, in addition to the additional political challenges that we face here in the United States and people around the world, but we have some particular challenges this year. We've had lots of competing priorities with economic issues, political issues, environmental issues, wildfires, all kinds of things that have taken the attention of the local legislators. And it's hard to explain to them why this issue needs to be on the table with some of those other issues. And that's a conversation that we continue to have. Another problem that we realized was they don't know what to do with this, and they don't know where this conversation should sit when we're trying to develop that the basis for having a conversation. So for instance, should it go in the water committee, the environmental committee, the agriculture committee? And that's important because people don't understand what aquaculture is and how it sits at the intersection of a number of important issues. There are consumer issues, there are worker issues, right? And so how do we frame this conversation and how do we talk about it? And so we thought, again, that a narrow framing at the beginning would be helpful, and that we could then broaden it after that. Once we get a toehold for a regulatory conversation at the state level, then we can broaden it. Because that didn't work, we decided that we should broaden it a little bit further for our next effort, right? And so one of the things that we also realized is we don't have the same kind of history of this kind of farming, at least in the continental United States. There's some history of this kind of aquaculture facilities in Hawaii, but not in the continental United States. And so again, people don't really understand how this works, and they don't understand, for instance, something really basic. They're like, well, we farm cows. We farm cows on a larger scale. That's not a problem. We're doing kind of the same thing that we've always done. We just do it bigger. But we don't always farm these animals, and we're farming carnivores. And that raises a whole bunch of different issues. And that's just one example of trying to educate folks about how these aquaculture systems are different than some of the other terrestrial factory farm situations that we have, and have additional problems, some of the similar problems and different problems. So what we've done is we've broadened our coalition, and we're focusing on the regulatory framework more broadly now. So we're focusing on welfare is one element, and within welfare, we're talking about slaughter, we're talking about enrichment, we're talking about stocking density, right? We're talking about antibiotic use. So we're talking about a number of things under the welfare prong, and then we're talking about the environmental prong, and then consumer issues. And under the consumer, we can address sort of the worker issues potentially as well. And so we also have to have help people understand that there's distinctions based on the environment in which these animals are raised. So we have open pens, we have in the water, but not in the full marine sort of environment, and we have indoors, right? We have on land open water, and then we have indoors factory settings. And so trying to help people understand the different issues that we need to discuss for each of those environments, helping people understand the different things we need to talk about for each of the species of animals. Right? So the slaughter process is going to look different for crustaceans than for finfish. And we need to be thinking about all of these elements. What does enrichment look like for these different kinds of animals if we're going to bring them all together? Okay, so we could talk more about that, and there may be some questions, but we wanted to save a couple of minutes before we open up for questions to talk about the larger questions that we sort of have been thinking about and framing in ways that we can broaden our experience here in the US, so that it's helpful for people both within the US and beyond. So maybe just jumping to that, one of the things I'll reiterate, because I've said it a little bit, is just the importance of science, right? So one of the things we have discovered is over and over, we have to be the ones to translate the scientific data for a lay audience or a legal sort of regulatory audience and help them understand what to make of that information, how to use it, how to implement it, and how to make it the basis of good decision making, right? So that we understand that we're looking for these scientific studies, we're looking to learn what the capacities of these animals are once we've decided that we want to be using them. And Sarah, do you want to add to that or to the next one?
Yeah, so as Kathy said, the animal welfare scientists, specifically those amazing individuals who are focusing on fish and other aquatic animal welfare, are going to be a key collaborator in our effort. And yeah, I just can't underscore that enough. There's just so much misunderstanding and just lack of any understanding about these animals and about the industry itself. In meeting with some legislators, Kathy and I multiple times were told, and I believe them 100%, that these well-educated, intelligent individuals said, I have to be honest with you, I've never in my entire life thought about this issue, and I think that's true of a lot of people. So the education piece of it, and then, explaining why fish and other aquatic species should receive the same protections as other animals that are farmed. There's really no coherent sound argument for excluding them. So the other types of collaborators that, depending on the industry, depending on the place where you live, you might consider reaching out to industry stakeholders themselves. There is some argument to be made that regulation can actually be beneficial for an industry, just so that everyone is operating on an equal playing field. Now, of course, the bigger companies, the cook aquacultures out there, are probably going to be resistant to that argument, but smaller operators and just maybe those who are trying to do a slightly better job might actually be able to get on board with the idea of being regulated to some extent. And then
I'll
also,
jump in really quickly to add that one of the things we tried to help regulators understand was, before the industry makes major investment in certain kinds of systems, it makes sense to have these conversations and do this work, so that we don't come back in a couple of years and say you're doing it wrong, right? No, we may say that, but and they may be doing it wrong, but we should at least be using the best available science. We should be using the best available technology at this point. And as Sarah said, the understanding is so minimal that when we had a meeting to talk about aquaculture, we sometimes had to step back and because the person we were talking to was talking about wild caught fish, we're like, no, that's not what we're talking about. So even the term aquaculture is not known or understood, and certainly the ways in which it operates and works is not known or understood. And so thinking about how we have these conversations. And as Sarah said, we actually talked with the industry stakeholders to see if we could do this together at the beginning. And we were working together for a little while, but it didn't stay that way, sort of understandably. But thinking about how we have these conversations, the terms we use, is really important when we're thinking about our collaborators. Sorry, go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, no, thank you for adding that. I just wanted to flag another potential collaborator on these sort of issues are the technological innovators out there, those who are trying to create these these stunning devices, for instance. Now they have a profit motive to see laws enacted that basically require that their products be used. And although that's coming, from a pure welfare perspective, as opposed to, others who are arguing against the farming of fish or consumption of fish altogether, which, is a very I think, a laudable position to take, and that's actually the position that animal equality would take. However, we also recognize that when we're talking about legislating for animals, oftentimes that requires a welfarist tack. And so just potentially reaching out to technological innovators, the companies making these stunning machines, and seeing if they would have any interest in getting involved in lobbying for these laws. I think
oops, sorry.
No, go ahead.
As you can tell, Sarah and I could talk about this for quite a long time, and each of the sort of points that we would want to make the entire presentations. And I recognize that we only have 5 minutes left for questions. And so I just want to put on the table that we also think, obviously, there's a long list of potential collaborators. So animal welfare and protection advocates, fisher folk. So we could talk about that more. But the 2 other things we just want to say before we open up for questions is that we think it's really important to connect the scientific proof of efficacy to the regulatory system and to the funding system, right? So before governments and private organizations fund systems or approve them, we should be going back to that scientific efficacy. And obviously, the other thing that's really important is to consider alternatives, right? So if we're talking about resource allocation, if we're talking about regulatory systems, we shouldn't be privileging the aquaculture system over plant-based or cell-based systems that have far less suffering in them. So we just want to put those issues out there as well. And we can say, obviously, the welfare of the wild-caught fish who are caught as feed for the aquaculture systems. All of these are really, really large questions that also need to be addressed, but we don't have time for. But having said that, we can stop and have some time for questions now.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Wow, that was fantastic. Thank you both so much. We can really see your passion, enthusiasm, and also obviously your expertise with so much insightful points that you made. I have a lot of questions myself, but we don't have a lot of time. I will go directly into our audience questions. So the first one to both is, what role is the US government playing to ensure compliance with existing fish welfare standards by fishing companies?
I can take that. The answer is basically none. So animal welfare in general is a state issue. So it's regulated at the state level. There are a few federal animal welfare laws on the books. None of them apply to fish, however. So that's actually a pretty short and sweet answer.
And to the degree that there are any industrial statements about welfare, as Sarah suggested, that's a sort of private right of action that consumers can take against the company for false advertising, not living up to their standards, but it's not a government role, at least right now in the US.
Great. And if you have any resources for how consumers can take action, maybe action alerts or anything like that, post it in the chat so people can follow up on that. And the second question is, has any litigation action been successfully taken against any violator? If yes, where is this reported? Other fish welfare groups might like to use this to influence industry players to adopt stiff welfare standards in their communities or regions.
You want to take that, Kathy?
Sure. Well, just starting from what Sarah just said, because we're starting from the point in the US where we don't have welfare standards for fish. And so they're excluded from the laws in a couple of ways. One, because farmed animal welfare, we don't have really in the US with some minimal exceptions. And then even when there's some farmed animal protection, fish are excluded from that. So they're doubly excluded. So we really just aren't starting from the point of having fish welfare standards to enforce. So that's part of what the catfish case was about, trying to say, okay, this isn't about welfare in the terms of how we're raising animals for food, but in terms of violating an anti-cruelty act. And because we don't have standards elsewhere, we're using what few laws we do have and trying to make them apply. And as you saw, people are like, that's not actually what this law is for. We're not really interested in doing that. It's not a priority. So we're struggling, right, to use the laws that we have and try and create new laws so that we can actually establish welfare standards.
Anything to add, Sarah?
No, that basically summed it up. There was a question I noticed in the chat that is related to that, and that is, whether amending the Federal Humane Methods of Slaughter Act would cover all aquaculture animal welfare. The short answer is that it would. The amendment we are proposing would at least apply to all catfish. It would apply. It would basically supersede any state law, so it would require federally inspected catfish slaughterhouses to comply with the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act. But yeah, it will take an even greater effort to extend that law, which is federal, to other species as well.
Great. Yeah, I think, the undercover investigations in slaughterhouses and in offshore aquaculture is really, really important for educating all of us on what's actually happening. Okay, I think we will squeeze in one more question. And what is your perspective on wild fisheries versus aquaculture? Wild fish suffering may be huge given the number of fish. Do you think that federal aquaculture management statutes with strong animal welfare constraints are needed to reduce pressure on wild fisheries?
I'll start really quickly by saying it doesn't help wild fisheries because we're still taking fish from the wild to feed the animals of the aquaculture facilities. So I would say, yes, I think strong welfare standards are needed in both contexts, but we're really not saving wild fish. We may be saving certain kinds of wild fish, right? We're taking different kinds of animals from the ocean and lakes and rivers and breeding them to put into the aquaculture facilities, but we are not saving fish by using aquaculture facilities.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely critical to underscore that point. When we're talking about aquaculture, we're not talking about aquaculture versus wild fisheries. We are talking about both at that point. We're talking about intensively farming species that suffer greatly, and fishing in oceans and environments that are incredibly sensitive and destroying the environment. So honestly, you can make a very strong argument that aquaculture is just the worst of both worlds, whereas obviously there's a lot of suffering in the wild capture fishing industry as well, but potentially less. But of course, then there's other problems with that. But yeah, just underscore a 1,000 times that aquaculture involves wild fishing.
Very great point. I think we have a lot of advocates here who would be interested in your future action alerts for any legislative work that's going on. So please keep us posted. And I think it's time for us to close this session. Unfortunately, we didn't get to all of the questions, but your presentation was super, super insightful. So I want to thank you both so much and thank the audience for joining us today. The next session starts in 7 minutes. So stay on and follow us on social media or visit our website at ali.fish for more ways you can get involved for protecting aquatic animals after this conference. So thank you all so much and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.